I sat at my desk long after the office had emptied, the overhead lights dimmed to a soft hum that barely touched the corners of the room. Outside the window, the city had begun its slow descent into evening. Cars threading through traffic below, their headlights smearing gold across wet pavement. I should have been home an hour ago, maybe two, but I stayed, paralyzed by the phone in my hand and the words glowing on its screen. I can't stop thinking about that look you gave me. I had read the message so many times I could recite it from memory. Each word had weight. Each pause between them felt deliberate, purposeful, like they had been chosen with care. I told myself I should delete it. I told myself I should turn off the phone, pack my things, and drive home to the life I had built, the one that depended on me being exactly who I had always been. But I didn't move. My wedding ring caught the light from the desk lamp as I twisted it absently around my finger. The metal was warm from my skin, worn smooth at the edges from years of wearing it. I stopped turning it and let my hand fall flat against the desk, where a photograph sat half-hidden beneath a stack of reports I had meant to review. My wife, my children, their faces frozen in a moment of happiness I could barely remember feeling. I had placed the photo there myself, weeks ago, after someone mentioned how strange it was that my desk held nothing personal. So I brought it in. And then, without meaning to, I began burying it beneath paperwork, as if hiding it from someone who might look too closely. As if hiding it from myself. My chest felt tight. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, but that only made it worse. Because then I was back at the work gathering, 3 days ago now, though it felt both impossibly distant and unbearably close. I could still hear the noise of the room. Laughter, clinking glasses, overlapping conversations. I could still feel the heat rising in my face when he said something that made everyone laugh, something I hadn't quite heard because I was too busy trying not to look at him. But I did look, and he caught me. It was just a moment. A flicker. His eyes meeting mine across the crowded room, holding for half a second longer than they should have. And in that half second, something passed between us that I couldn't name, couldn't explain, couldn't take back. My face went hot. I looked away too quickly, and when I glanced back, he was still watching me, and there was something in his expression, something curious, something careful, that made my stomach turn over. Later, someone teased me about blushing. I laughed it off. I always laugh things off. That was what I did. That was who I was supposed to be. But the look stayed with me. It followed me home. It sat beside me at dinner while my wife talked about her day, and I nodded without hearing. It lingered in the spaces between words, in the silences I filled with distractions. And then, 2 nights later, the text arrived. I had stared at the unknown number for a full minute before opening the message. And when I read it, something inside me cracked open, something I had spent years learning how to keep shut. I set the phone face down on the desk and rubbed my eyes. I had done everything right. I had followed every rule, made every expected choice. I had married the woman I was supposed to marry. I had built the life I was supposed to build. I had become the man everyone believed I was. And now, sitting alone in the dark, I realized how fragile it all was. How easily it could be undone by something as small and dangerous as a blush, as a look, as a single text message I couldn't stop reading. I picked up the phone again. The screen lit up my face in the dim room. My thumb hovered over the delete button, but I couldn't press it. Instead, I read the words one more time, feeling the weight of them settle deeper into my chest. I can't stop thinking about that look you gave me. Neither could I. My life had always been established. Predictable. Safe in the way that things become safe when you stop questioning them. I lived in a quiet suburb where the houses all looked vaguely similar. 2 stories, neat lawns, driveways that held sedans and SUVs in careful arrangement. Our home sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, bordered by a row of maple trees that turned brilliant colors in autumn and dropped their leaves in tidy piles come October. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved at each other from their front porches and knew the names of each other's dogs. Elise and I had bought the house 7 years ago, right after our second child was born. It had seemed like the natural next step, the right thing to do. Marriage, children, mortgage. Each milestone arrived on schedule, and I had checked them off without hesitation, believing that this was what happiness looked like. Our mornings followed a rhythm so familiar it had become invisible. The alarm at 6:30. The sound of small feet padding down the hallway. Cereal boxes pulled from the cupboard. Milk poured into bowls with cartoon characters printed on the sides. Elise moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, packing lunches, signing permission slips, reminding me about carpool schedules I would forget by the time I reached my car. We spoke to each other in the language of logistics. Did you remember to pay the electric bill? We need to schedule that dentist appointment. I think the car needs an oil change. Conversations that required no real answers, just the reassurance that the machinery of our life was still functioning. Over coffee, Elise talked about her plans. A vacation she wanted to take next summer. Refinancing the mortgage to get a better rate. Repainting the guest bedroom. I nodded along, offering sounds of agreement at the appropriate moments, but my mind drifted elsewhere. It always drifted elsewhere. Our marriage was not cruel. That was important to understand. There was no anger between us, no raised voices or slammed doors. Elise was kind. She was patient. She deserved better than what I was capable of giving her, though I could never say that aloud. What we had was functional, comfortable in the way that old furniture is comfortable, worn in, familiar, requiring no adjustment. But somewhere beneath that comfort was a staleness I couldn't ignore. The air between us had grown thin, like we were both holding our breath without realizing it, waiting for something neither of us could name. At night, we sat on opposite ends of the couch, her scrolling through her phone while I pretended to read. Sometimes she would tell me about something funny one of the kids had said at school, and I would smile and say that's great, and mean it, in a distant sort of way. And then the silence would return, filling the space between us like water. I told myself this was normal, that every marriage settled into routine after enough years, that the initial spark was supposed to fade into something steadier, more sustainable. I told myself I was content, but late at night, alone in the dark, I felt the loneliness pressing against my chest, a quiet, persistent ache I had learned to live with so well I barely noticed it anymore. Work was no different. I had been with the same company for 12 years, moving through promotions with the same quiet dependability that defined every other part of my life. My colleagues knew me as reliable, competent, and almost aggressively unremarkable. I arrived on time. I met deadlines. I never caused problems. My office was on the 4th floor, a small square space with a window that overlooked the parking lot. The walls were beige. The desk was standard issue. For years, I had kept it deliberately sterile. No plants, no artwork, nothing that might invite questions about who I was beyond the work I produced. The framed photograph of my family had been a recent addition, placed there only after a co-worker mentioned in passing how strange it was that my desk held no personal touches. So I brought the photo in, set it on the corner of my desk, and immediately felt like a fraud, as if I were playing a role in a production I hadn't auditioned for. My co-workers were easy with each other in a way I envied and feared. They laughed loudly in the break room, shared stories about their weekends, teased each other with the casual affection of people who felt no need to guard themselves. Sometimes they included me in their jokes, and I would smile and offer a polite response, but I always felt like I was watching from a distance, separated by glass I couldn't break through. They called me Serious Nathan, not unkindly, but with a knowing tone that suggested they had already decided who I was. The quiet one. The responsible one. The one who never let loose or did anything unexpected. And they were right. I had spent so long being that person that I no longer knew if there was anyone else underneath. But beneath the carefully maintained surface of my life, there was something else. A current running deep and silent, like water moving beneath ice. It had been there for as long as I could remember. A loneliness I could never quite articulate. A sense of waiting for something I couldn't identify. I had learned to ignore it, to bury it beneath work and family obligations and the endless small tasks that filled my days. I had learned to smile at the right moments, to say the right things, to perform the version of myself that everyone expected. And for years, it had worked. I had convinced myself that this was enough, that wanting more was selfish, ungrateful, dangerous. But now, sitting at my desk with that text message burning in my pocket, I felt the ice beginning to crack. And I didn't know whether I was more terrified of what might break through or of spending the rest of my life pretending I had never felt it at all. Julian arrived in late September, when the leaves were just beginning to turn and the air carried the first hint of cold. He was brought in to lead a new project, something about streamlining operations and increasing efficiency. Details I barely registered because I was too busy trying not to notice him. He was younger than me by several years, though I couldn't say exactly how many. Early 30s, maybe. There was an ease to him that I found unsettling, a kind of natural confidence that seemed effortless. He moved through the office like he belonged there, like he had always belonged everywhere he went, and people gravitated toward him without him having to try. In meetings, he laughed too loudly. He made jokes that bordered on inappropriate, but somehow never crossed the line. He leaned back in his chair with his arms behind his head, completely relaxed, while the rest of us sat rigid and formal. And when he spoke, people listened, not because he demanded attention, but because he made everything sound interesting, like he genuinely cared about what he was saying. I told myself I found him irritating. Too casual. Too familiar. He used people's first names immediately, as if he had known them for years. He brought coffee for the team without being asked. He remembered small details, someone's child's soccer game, another person's upcoming vacation, and asked about them later with what seemed like genuine interest. I kept my distance. I responded to his questions in meetings with brief, professional answers. I avoided the break room when I heard his voice there. I told myself it was because I preferred to work alone, that I had no interest in his performative friendliness. But the truth was something darker and more complicated. The truth was that when he walked into a room, I felt my chest tighten. When he smiled at me in passing, I found myself unable to hold his gaze. When he spoke, I listened to every word, even as I pretended to focus on my work. I envied him. That was part of it. I envied the way he moved through the world without apologizing for taking up space. I envied his ease, his lightness, the way he seemed untouched by the weight that pressed down on the rest of us. But there was something else too, something I refused to name. The work dinner happened on a Thursday evening, at a restaurant downtown that someone from accounting had chosen. The entire team was invited, one of those forced social gatherings meant to boost morale and encourage collaboration. I had considered not going, inventing some excuse about family obligations, but Elise had encouraged me. "You should go," she had said. "You never do anything with your coworkers." So I went. The restaurant was loud and crowded, filled with the competing sounds of conversation and clattering dishes. We sat at a long table near the back, packed in close together, passing menus and bottles of wine back and forth. I took a seat near the end, hoping to remain inconspicuous, but Julian ended up directly across from me, close enough that I could see the small scar above his left eyebrow and smell the faint scent of his cologne. He was in the middle of a story when I sat down, something about a disastrous camping trip that had everyone laughing. I tried to focus on my menu, but I kept glancing up, watching the way his hands moved as he spoke, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. At some point, someone made a joke at my expense, something harmless about how I never joined them for happy hour, about how I was always the first to leave the office. I laughed it off the way I always did, offering a self-deprecating comment about being boring. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He said something then, something I didn't quite catch because I was too aware of his attention suddenly focused entirely on me. Whatever it was made the table erupt in laughter, and I felt the heat rising in my face, that familiar flush of embarrassment I had never learned to control. He noticed immediately. His smile widened, and he tilted his head, eyes bright with something I couldn't quite read. "Are you blushing, Nathaniel?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough to be heard over the noise. The table laughed again, good-natured and teasing, but I couldn't hear them anymore. All I could hear was the sound of my own pulse in my ears. I looked down at my plate, willing the heat in my face to subside, but when I finally glanced up, Julian was still watching me. His expression had changed. The teasing smile was still there, but beneath it was something else, something careful and curious, like he was seeing me for the first time. Our eyes met across the table, and the moment stretched longer than it should have. Long enough for me to notice the way he was really looking at me, not through me the way most people did. Long enough for something unspoken to pass between us. I broke eye contact first, fumbling for my water glass and taking a long drink I didn't need. The conversation moved on, the moment dissolved, and I told myself I had imagined it. But I hadn't imagined it. I knew I hadn't. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. I barely tasted my food. I contributed nothing to the conversation, just nodded along and offered occasional sounds of agreement. All I could think about was that look, the weight of it, the way it had settled somewhere deep in my chest and refused to leave. When the evening finally ended, I said my goodbyes quickly and walked to my car in the cold night air, grateful for the silence and the distance. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the dashboard, trying to shake the feeling that something had shifted, something I couldn't take back. I drove home, parked in the driveway, and sat there for another 10 minutes before finally going inside. Elise was already asleep. The house was dark and quiet. I moved through it like a ghost, careful not to wake anyone, and when I finally lay down in bed, I stared at the ceiling until the numbers on the clock blurred together. The text arrived 2 nights later. I was sitting in my car again, parked in the driveway after another late night at the office I hadn't needed to stay for. My phone buzzed, and I glanced at the screen, expecting a message from Elise or a notification I could ignore. Instead, there was an unknown number, and beneath it, words that stopped my breath. I shouldn't have teased you, but that look you gave me, I can't stop thinking about it. I stared at the message for a full minute, maybe longer. My hands were shaking. I read it again, and again. I tried to convince myself it was a mistake, a wrong number, something explainable. But I knew who it was from. I knew before I even finished reading it. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I sat there in the dark, the phone screen glowing in my hands, and felt the ground beneath me begin to shift. I didn't respond to the text that night, or the next morning. I told myself I would delete it, that I would pretend it had never arrived, that I would go back to the careful routine of my life and forget the way those words had made my hands shake. But I didn't delete it. Instead, I found myself reading it at strange moments throughout the day, standing in line at the coffee shop, sitting at my desk between meetings, lying awake in bed while Elise slept beside me. Each time, I felt that same jolt in my chest, that same mix of terror and something else I couldn't allow myself to examine too closely. 3 days passed before I finally replied. I was sitting in my car outside the house again, the engine off, the street empty and dark. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for what felt like hours. Everything I typed seemed wrong. Too casual, too formal, too revealing, not honest enough. Finally, I wrote, "I didn't give you any look." It was a lie. We both knew it was a lie, but it was all I could manage. His response came within minutes, as if he had been waiting. "You did. And I'm not sorry I noticed." That was how it began. The messages started cautiously, like we were both testing the boundaries of something we didn't understand. He would text me during the day, nothing inappropriate at first, just observations about work, comments about things that had happened in meetings. I would respond with brief, careful replies, always maintaining some distance, always aware of the line I was approaching but not yet crossing. But gradually, without either of us acknowledging it, the conversations began to change. They grew longer, more personal. He told me about growing up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, about feeling trapped by expectations he could never quite meet. I told him about the suburb where I lived, about the sameness of every day, about the way I sometimes felt like I was watching my own life from the outside. We didn't talk about the dinner. We didn't talk about the look. We didn't name what was happening between us. Instead, we traded pieces of ourselves in fragments, small confessions that felt safer than the larger truth neither of us was ready to speak aloud. I began staying up later, long after Elise had gone to bed. I would sit in the darkened living room, phone screen casting a pale light across my face, typing messages I would have been terrified for anyone else to see. Sometimes I would sit in my car in the driveway, unable to bring myself to go inside, needing just a few more minutes in this private space where I could be honest in ways I had never allowed myself before. The nights in the car became a refuge. I would pull into the driveway after work and simply sit there, the house dark and quiet in front of me, my family sleeping inside while I existed in this strange liminal space between the life I had built and something else entirely. Sometimes I stayed there for an hour, sometimes longer, my breath fogging the windows as I typed and deleted and typed again, trying to find words for feelings I had spent my entire life learning to suppress. At work, everything changed and nothing changed. We were professional with each other during meetings, careful to maintain the same distance we always had. But now there was a current running beneath every interaction, an awareness that hummed between us even when we weren't speaking. A touch on my shoulder as he passed my desk that lingered half a second too long. A smile across the conference room that held a question I wasn't ready to answer. The way his eyes would find mine in a crowded room, just for a moment, just long enough for me to feel my pulse quicken. I found myself waking with anticipation, something I hadn't felt in years. I would stand in front of my closet in the morning, considering what to wear with more care than I had in longer than I could remember. I noticed details I had stopped seeing. The way the light came through my office window in the afternoon, the sound of his laugh from down the hallway, the exact moment each day when I knew he would arrive at work. I was more present in my body than I had been since I was young, more aware of myself as something physical, something capable of wanting. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, this sudden consciousness of my own aliveness. Elise noticed the change, though she couldn't have known what caused it. "You seem different lately," she said one morning over coffee. "Happier, maybe. Or just, I don't know. Different." I told her I had been sleeping better. She smiled and said that was good, and the conversation moved on to other things, the grocery list, the car inspection, the endless logistics of our shared life. But I saw the way she looked at me sometimes, like she was trying to figure out what had shifted, what piece of me had moved just slightly out of alignment. I felt guilty about the lie, but not guilty enough to stop. The truth was that I had started laughing more. I had started noticing things, the taste of my morning coffee, the feel of sun through my office window, the way music sounded when I really listened to it. I felt like I was waking up from a long sleep I hadn't known I was in. Julian and I began sharing more than just surface details. Late one night, he told me about his first relationship, about the fear and relief of finally admitting something about himself he had always known but never spoken. I read his message 3 times, my heart pounding, understanding that he was telling me something important, that he was creating space for me to share something in return. I didn't tell him about myself that night. I wasn't ready. But I told him about the loneliness, the specific kind that comes from spending your whole life feeling like you're pretending to be someone you're not. I told him about the weight of always being the person everyone expected me to be and never knowing if there was anyone else underneath. He responded, "I see you. The real you, I mean. I have from the beginning." I sat with those words for a long time, unable to type a response, because something inside me knew they were true. He had seen something in me that I had spent decades hiding, and instead of looking away, he had moved closer. The friendship, if that was the right word for it, became a lifeline. I found myself structuring my days around the moments when I could talk to him, the lunch breaks when we would eat at our desks and exchange messages across the office, the late evenings when everyone else had left and we could have actual conversations in person, brief and careful, but crackling with everything we weren't saying. One afternoon, we ended up in the break room at the same time, both reaching for the coffee pot. Our hands touched, just for a second, and he didn't pull away immediately. He looked at me, and I looked back, and neither of us moved. The moment was so brief I could have convinced myself I imagined it, except for the way my skin felt electric where we had made contact. "I'm glad you're here," he said quietly, and I understood he wasn't talking about the break room. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just nodded and stepped back, putting safe distance between us, and walked out with my coffee forgotten on the counter. But that night, alone in my car in the driveway, I typed, "I'm glad you're here too." And somewhere inside me, something that had been dormant for so long I had forgotten it existed began to stir awake. It was painful and beautiful and terrifying all at once. This feeling of coming back to myself, of remembering that I was more than the roles I played and the expectations I met. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know where this was leading. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt alive in a way that seemed to matter. And even though I knew I should be more frightened than I was, even though I knew everything I had built was balanced on the edge of something I couldn't control, I couldn't bring myself to stop. I couldn't bring myself to go back to sleep. The meeting ran late on a Tuesday evening in November, when the days had grown short and the darkness came early. By the time we finished, the office was nearly empty, just a few scattered lights in distant cubicles where someone was working overtime. I gathered my things slowly, unnecessarily organizing papers that didn't need organizing, aware that Julian was doing the same thing at the other end of the conference table. We had barely spoken during the meeting, but I had felt his presence the entire time, hyper-aware of every movement he made. When I finally stood to leave, he did too. We walked to the elevator together in silence, the hallway stretching out long and quiet around us. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and we stepped inside. "Do you need a ride?" he asked as the doors closed. "I saw your car in the shop this morning." I had taken an Uber to work that day, something I rarely did. I should have lied, should have said I had already arranged for a ride home. Instead, I heard myself say, "That would be helpful. Thank you." His car was parked on the far side of the lot, under one of the few working streetlights. We walked across the empty pavement, our footsteps echoing in the cold air. Neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavy with something unspoken, like the air before a storm. He unlocked the car, and we got in. He started the engine, but didn't put it in gear. Instead, he sat there with his hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead through the windshield at the dark office building. "What's your address?" he asked. I told him. He entered it into his phone, and the route appeared on the screen. 18 minutes, a path through streets I had driven 1,000 times. He pulled out of the parking lot and onto the main road, and we drove in silence for several minutes. The only sound the quiet hum of the engine and the occasional whoosh of passing cars. I watched the familiar landmarks slide past the window, the coffee shop where I sometimes stopped on weekends, the park where I had taken my children when they were younger, the intersection where I turned every day on my way home. Everything looked different at night, stranger and more remote, like I was seeing it all for the first time. As we got closer to my neighborhood, I felt something tightening in my chest. I didn't want the drive to end. I didn't want to go back to my house, to my life, to the careful performance I had maintained for so long. I wanted to stay in this suspended moment, this in-between space where I didn't have to be anyone but myself. Julian turned onto my street and slowed down, the houses passing by one after another with their lit windows and neat lawns. "Turn here?" he asked, and I nodded. He pulled up to the curb in front of my house and put the car in park. The house was dark except for a single light in the upstairs window, our bedroom, where Elise was probably already asleep. The street was empty and quiet, the kind of suburban silence that felt both peaceful and suffocating. Neither of us moved to get out. Julian turned off the engine, and suddenly the quiet was different, more immediate. I could hear him breathing. I could hear my own heart beating in my ears. The space between us felt charged with something I had been trying not to acknowledge for weeks. "I wasn't lying about that look," he said finally, his voice soft in the darkness. "I've thought about it every day since." The words hung in the air between us. I kept my eyes forward, staring at the dashboard, unable to turn and face him. My throat felt tight. Every instinct I had developed over decades was screaming at me to open the door, to thank him for the ride, to go inside and pretend this conversation had never happened. But I didn't move. "I think about it too," I said, the words coming out barely above a whisper. I felt him shift beside me, and then I felt the weight of his gaze. Slowly, like I was moving through water, I turned to look at him. His face was half in shadow, illuminated only by the distant streetlight and the faint glow from my house. His eyes held mine, and I saw in them something I recognized because I felt it too, a mixture of hope and fear and longing that had no name. "Nathaniel," he said, and the way he spoke my name made something crack open inside me. For a suspended moment, the world held perfectly still. I was aware of everything: the cold air seeping in through the vents, the sound of a dog barking somewhere far away, the faint smell of his cologne, the way my hands were gripping the edge of the seat like I might fall if I let go. I felt the gravity of everything I had kept buried pulling at me, demanding to be acknowledged. Every carefully constructed wall I had built, every lie I had told myself, every moment I had looked away from the truth, all of it was collapsing in the space of that single moment. My hand moved before I fully realized what I was doing. It lifted from the seat, reached across the small distance between us, and then stopped, hovering in the air. I could feel the heat coming off his body. I could see the way he was looking at my hand, at me, waiting. And then, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I stopped myself. My hand twitched, frozen in the space between intention and action, and then I pulled it back, curling my fingers into a fist against my thigh. "I can't," I said, the words breaking as they came out. He didn't look away. He didn't move. He just nodded, slowly, and I saw understanding in his eyes that somehow made it worse. Because he understood exactly what I was afraid of. He understood the cost of what I wanted and couldn't let myself have. "I should go," I said. "I know," he replied. But still, neither of us moved. We sat there in the darkness, separated by inches that might as well have been miles, both of us aware that something had irrevocably changed between us. That this moment, this almost moment, would stay with us in ways we couldn't predict. Finally, I forced myself to reach for the door handle. "Thank you for the ride," I said, the words absurdly formal given everything that had just passed between us. "Anytime," he said softly. I got out of the car and closed the door behind me. The cold air hit my face like a slap, and I stood there on the sidewalk for a moment, trying to steady myself. Behind me, I heard his engine start again. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I walked up the path to my front door, my legs feeling uncertain beneath me. I heard his car pull away, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. I stood on my front step with my key in my hand, staring at the door I had walked through 1,000 times before. And then, instead of going inside, I turned and looked down the empty street where his taillights had disappeared. The night was dark and cold and silent. I stood there, feeling the weight of everything I had almost done, everything I had almost said. That night, I went to the bathroom and closed the door behind me. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my own reflection in the harsh fluorescent light. The man looking back at me was familiar, the same face I had seen every day for nearly 40 years. But something about him was different now. Something in his eyes had changed. I leaned closer to the glass, studying this stranger who looked like me but felt like someone I was only beginning to know. I saw the fear there, yes, but I saw something else too. Something that looked almost like hope, or possibility, or the beginning of truth. For the first time in my life, I felt truly awake. Every nerve in my body seemed alive, electric with the knowledge of what I had almost reached for in that car. What I had wanted, what I still wanted, even now, even standing in my own bathroom while my wife slept in the next room. I pressed my palms against the cool porcelain of the sink and closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. But all I could see was Julian's face in the darkness. All I could feel was that moment of suspension when my hand had hung in the air between us, trembling with possibility. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know what came next. But I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that I could never go back to the person I had been before. That man was gone, and in his place stood someone I barely recognized, someone who had tasted the possibility of being seen, of being known, and couldn't untaste it. I opened my eyes and looked at my reflection one more time. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't look away. The secret grew heavier with each passing day. It sat in my chest like a stone, pressing against my ribs, making it hard to breathe. I carried it with me everywhere, to work, to home, through conversations with Elise that felt increasingly hollow, through dinners where I pushed food around my plate and pretended to listen. After that night in the car, something had shifted between Julian and me. We still exchanged messages, but they were different now. weighted with everything we had almost said, almost done. At work, we maintained our careful distance, but the awareness between us had grown unbearable. Every glance felt like a confession. Every accidental touch felt like a promise neither of us could keep. I found myself existing in a state of constant tension, stretched thin between two versions of my life that couldn't coexist. There was the life everyone could see, the husband, the father, the reliable employee who showed up on time and met his deadlines. And then there was this other life, the one that lived in stolen moments and unspoken words, the one that felt more real than anything else even as it remained impossible. Elise began to notice. Of course she did. She had lived with me for more than a decade. She knew my patterns, my rhythms, the small tells that gave me away even when I thought I was being careful. It started with small questions. You seem distracted lately. Is everything okay at work? I answered with vague reassurances, blaming stress and long hours and projects that required my attention. She nodded and accepted my explanations, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. Then came the silences. Long stretches where she would watch me across the dinner table or from the other end of the couch, her expression unreadable. I felt the weight of her gaze and couldn't meet it, couldn't bear to see what she might have already figured out. One evening, I came home later than usual. I had stayed at the office after everyone else left, sitting at my desk and staring at my computer screen without seeing it, unable to face the drive home. When I finally walked through the door, Elise was in the kitchen, cleaning up from dinner I had missed. She didn't turn around when I entered. She kept washing dishes, her movements precise and controlled, and I knew immediately that something was wrong. You've been working late a lot, she said, her voice flat. I know. I'm sorry. Things have been busy. Have they? The question hung in the air. I stood in the doorway, my keys still in my hand, feeling the careful structure of my lies beginning to crack. She turned off the water and dried her hands on a towel, still not looking at me. Where were you tonight? At the office. I told you. Until 9:30. I had lost track of time. I know it's late. I'm sorry. She finally turned to face me, and what I saw in her expression made my stomach drop. It wasn't anger. It was something worse, a kind of quiet knowing, a resignation that suggested she had already figured out more than I had admitted to myself. Is there someone else? She asked. The question landed like a physical blow. I stood there, unable to move, unable to speak. Every prepared excuse evaporated from my mind. The silence stretched between us, growing louder with each passing second. Nathaniel, she said again, and her voice cracked slightly on my name. Is there someone else? I wanted to lie. I had spent my entire life lying, to her and to myself and to everyone around me. One more lie should have been easy, but standing there in our kitchen, under the harsh overhead light, I found I couldn't do it anymore. I don't know how to answer that, I said finally. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, bitter and sad. That's an answer. She walked past me, out of the kitchen and up the stairs. I heard our bedroom door close, not slammed, but shut with a finality that felt worse than anger. I stood alone in the kitchen for a long time, the keys still in my hand, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. That night, I slept on the couch. Or tried to. Mostly I lay awake in the darkness, staring at the ceiling and feeling the full weight of what I had done, what I was doing, pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. At work the next day, I avoided Julian. I stayed in my office with the door closed, responding to emails and attending virtual meetings where I could keep my camera off. But in the afternoon, he appeared in my doorway. We need to talk, he said. Not here. Then where? I don't know. I don't know. He stepped into my office and closed the door behind him. When he spoke, his voice was low, urgent. I can't keep doing this, Nathaniel. Pretending. Existing in whatever this is. It's killing me. I looked at him and saw the strain in his face, the same exhaustion I felt reflected back at me. What do you want me to say? I want you to tell me what you want, not what you think you should want, not what's safe or expected, what you actually want. I can't give you that answer. Why not? Because I have a family, I said, the words coming out harder than I intended. I have children. I have a wife who just asked me last night if there's someone else, and I couldn't even answer her honestly, because I don't know what the truth is anymore. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. The truth is that you feel something. The truth is that this means something. You can't pretend it doesn't. I'm not pretending, I said. That's the problem. I can't pretend anymore, and I don't know what to do with that. He took a step closer, and I felt that familiar pull, that magnetic force that had been drawing me toward him since the first moment I saw him. But now, in the cold fluorescent light of my office, it felt different. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one more step would send me over. I can't keep waiting in the shadows, he said. I can't keep being your secret. I need to know if this is real to you, or if I'm just something you're trying out, something you'll walk away from when it gets too hard. The words hit me like an accusation, even though his tone wasn't harsh. Because he was right. I had been treating this like something I could contain, control, keep separate from the rest of my life. But feelings don't work that way. Love doesn't work that way. Love. The word echoed in my mind, and I realized with a jolt that was what this was. What I had been afraid to name. What I had been running from even as I ran toward it. I need time, I said. How much time? I don't know. He nodded slowly, and I saw the disappointment in his eyes, the resignation. That's what I thought you'd say. He turned to leave, his hand on the doorknob, and panic surged through me. Wait, I said. He stopped but didn't turn around. This is real to me, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. It's the most real thing I've felt in years. Maybe ever. And that's what makes it terrifying. He turned then, and I saw his expression soften slightly. So what are we going to do? I don't know, I admitted. I don't have an answer. I just need you to know that this isn't nothing to me. You're not nothing to me. He held my gaze for a long moment, and I saw him weighing something, deciding something. Okay, he said finally. But Nathaniel, you need to figure this out. Because I can't live in limbo forever. And neither can you. After he left, I sat at my desk with my head in my hands, feeling the walls closing in around me. I thought about Elisa's question, about the way she had looked at me with that quiet knowing. I thought about my children, about the life I had built, about all the people who depended on me being who they believed I was. And I thought about Julian, about the way I felt when I was with him, about the possibility of being seen and known and loved for who I actually was. The choice before me was unbearable. Stay and live the rest of my life as half a person, pretending and performing and slowly dying inside. Or leave and destroy everything I had built, hurt everyone who trusted me, become the kind of person who abandons his family for his own happiness. There was no good answer. No choice that didn't come with devastating cost. And yet I knew I couldn't keep existing in this suspended state, caught between two lives, belonging fully to neither. Something had to break. Something had to give. And I was terrified that when it did, there would be nothing left of me to salvage from the wreckage. I sit alone in the kitchen as dawn begins to break. The house is silent around me. That particular stillness that comes just before everyone wakes, when the world feels suspended between darkness and light. My coffee sits untouched on the table, growing cold. I watch the steam rise from it in thin wisps, disappearing into the air. On the counter beside the sink, my wedding ring rests where I placed it an hour ago. I haven't been able to look at it directly since I took it off. The pale band of skin on my finger feels exposed, vulnerable, like a wound that hasn't yet learned to hurt. Through the window, I can see the street beginning to brighten. The maple trees are bare now, their branches stark against the gray sky. In a few hours, this kitchen will fill with the familiar sounds of morning, cereal being poured, backpacks being zipped, the rush of getting ready for school and work. The machinery of our life will start up again, same as it always has. But I know now that nothing will be the same. I take out my phone and open my messages. Julian's name sits at the top of the list. Our last exchange was yesterday afternoon. His message saying he hoped I was okay, my response saying I needed time to think. I scroll up through weeks of conversations, reading fragments of what we've shared. All these words, all these moments, all this truth I've been afraid to speak aloud. I open a new message and begin to type. The cursor blinks at me, waiting. My fingers hover over the keyboard, trembling slightly. I write, I need to see you. I delete it. I write, I've made my choice. I delete that too. I write, I don't know what I'm doing, but I can't keep living like this. My thumb hovers over the send button. One tap, and everything changes. One tap, and I step off the edge into something I can't take back. I can feel my heart beating in my chest, can hear the blood rushing in my ears. Every instinct I've developed over a lifetime is screaming at me to stop, to put the phone down, to go back to the life I know. But I can't. Because that life, the one where I pretend and perform and bury everything real about myself, isn't sustainable anymore. It's already breaking. It's been breaking for months, maybe for years, maybe since the beginning. I think about Elise, still sleeping upstairs. I think about my children, who will wake soon to a father they thought they knew. I think about all the ways this will hurt them, all the damage I'm about to cause. The guilt sits heavy in my stomach, a physical weight that makes it hard to breathe. But I also think about Julian, about the way he looks at me like I matter, like I'm someone worth knowing, about the feeling of being seen, really seen, for the first time in my life, about the possibility of living honestly, even if that honesty comes at a terrible cost. There is no good choice here. There is only the choice between continuing to die slowly inside or risking everything for the chance to finally be alive. I close my eyes and take one slow breath. Then another. The house remains quiet around me. In this moment, I'm suspended between two futures, one I can predict, one I can't even imagine, both terrifying in different ways. When I open my eyes, the kitchen looks the same as it always has. The same table where we've eaten 1,000 meals. The same counters I've wiped down every night. The same window looking out onto the same street. But I'm different now. I've crossed some invisible line, and there's no going back to who I was before. My finger hovers over the send button again. The message sits there, waiting. 8 simple words that feel impossibly heavy. I don't know what I'm doing, but I can't keep living like this. Outside, I hear the first sounds of the neighborhood waking up, a car door closing, a dog barking in the distance. Soon the sun will be fully up. Soon this house will fill with voices and movement and the demands of another day. Soon I will have to face everyone and explain something I don't fully understand myself. But right now, in this suspended moment before everything changes, I allow myself to simply exist, to feel the weight of what I'm about to do, to acknowledge the fear and the hope and the terrible uncertainty of not knowing what comes next. I look at my wedding ring on the counter, at the photograph of my family stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet, at all the evidence of the life I've built. And then I look back at my phone, at those 8 words that hold everything I've been too afraid to say. The refrigerator hums quietly in the background. The clock on the wall ticks forward. Time keeps moving whether I'm ready or not. I take one more breath, slow, deliberate, like I'm breathing for the first time. Like I'm learning what it means to be alive and awake and honest, even when honesty means losing everything you thought you needed. And in that breath, I find something I didn't expect. Not certainty, I don't have that. Not answers. Those will take time, maybe years, to find. But I find the smallest seed of courage, the beginning of truth, the acceptance that I can't keep living as half a person, no matter how much easier that would be. My thumb rests against the screen. The moment stretches out, infinite and impossibly brief. And somewhere in the silence of this kitchen, in the gray light of early morning, I feel myself standing on the threshold of my own life, terrified, hopeful, and finally, desperately ready to step through.